Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are going to really dive deep into something that's super relevant for all you future nurses out there.
Ooh, exciting.
It is. We're talking
Right.
about all those consumer interests and concerns around food.
Yeah, that's a big one these days.
It really is. There's so much information out there,
Yeah.
and sometimes it feels like everyone's got a different opinion about what's healthy and what's not.
Right. It can get overwhelming.
Totally. So
Yeah.
we're going to cut through the noise and try to figure out what really matters, especially when it comes to advising your future patients. They're going to be looking to you for guidance.
Absolutely. And that's where this deep dive comes in.
Exactly. We'll be exploring everything from functional foods and organic labeling to the truth about GMOs and how to actually help patients make sense of all the conflicting nutrition advice they're bombarded with on a daily basis.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. But that's what we're here for, to break it down and make it digestible. So let's jump right in.
One of the first things that struck me when I was doing research for this deep dive was just how much nutrition information is out there.
It's like drinking from a fire
Well,
hose.
seriously.
Uh,
And how much of it just seems to contradict itself.
oh, yeah. 1 minute something is good for you, and the next minute it's public enemy number one. It's hard to keep up.
Right. It's overwhelming even for someone like me who actually loves this stuff. Imagine trying to navigate all of that as a patient.
I can't even imagine. It would be so easy to just throw your hands up and say,
Yeah.
forget it.
Totally. So how can we equip ourselves and our patients with the tools to actually sort through all this and figure out what's actually reliable? Because that's what we need to be able to do, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's a crucial skill, both for healthcare professionals and just for everyday life.
Yeah.
We're bombarded with information constantly.
All the time. So we need a good filter.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking comes in. Critical thinking.
Huh.
Okay, so what does that actually look like when we're talking about nutrition information? What are some things we should be looking for? Or maybe red flags we should be aware of?
Well, one of the sources I came across actually uses a really interesting example. It talks about this guy named Paul.
Okay, Paul? What's Paul's story?
So Paul has developmental disabilities, and he's learning to live independently for the first time after his mother passed away.
Oh, wow. That's a big transition.
Huge. And imagine, he's never had to shop or cook for himself before. Now he's trying to navigate the grocery store with all those conflicting messages about what's healthy.
Oh my gosh. That's a recipe for disaster.
Right. It highlights how important nutrition education is, but also how crucial it is to be able to evaluate sources critically.
Absolutely. Because if you don't know what to trust, you're basically just guessing.
Exactly. And you could end up making choices that are actually harmful to your health. So how do we avoid that? How do we help Paul and ourselves make sense of it all? Well, the source lays out some practical tips. We need to ask ourselves, who conducted the research?
Okay, so looking at the source of the information.
Right. Was it published in a reputable journal? Are they trying to sell me something? Because that's a big one.
Oh yeah, I'm always skeptical of those miracle cures or one weird trick, solutions that promise amazing results.
Yeah. Healthy skepticism is a good thing. And it's also super important to remember that just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other.
You mean like correlation doesn't equal causation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a classic research pitfall, and it's one that's often exploited in the world of nutrition. You see a headline like, eating chocolate makes you smarter, and you're like, sign me up.
Right. But then you dig a little deeper and find out the study was tiny or poorly designed.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of funding. You got to ask yourself, who paid for this research? Was it an independent organization or a company that stands to profit from the results?
Ooh, good point. That could definitely influence the outcome of a study.
Absolutely. So whenever you come across a bold claim, a new diet fad, or anything that sounds too good to be true, take a breath.
Don't get swept up in the hype.
Right. Dig a little deeper. Look at the methodology, the sample size, and look for potential biases. And be wary of those clickbaity headlines.
So basically, we need to be informed consumers of information, not just passive recipients.
100%. We need to be actively engaged in evaluating the information we're taking in. And that applies to everything, not just nutrition, from the news we read to the products we buy.
It's like we need to be detectives in every area of our lives.
You said it. And once we develop those critical thinking skills, we can apply them to the food choices we make for ourselves and the advice we give to our patients.
Okay, so we've got our detective hats on, and we're ready to tackle the nutrition maze. Now, let's dive into a topic that I find really fascinating. Functional foods.
Ooh, yes. This is a hot topic.
It is. It feels like everyone's talking about functional foods these days. But what are they exactly? And why should nursing students care about them? I mean, is this just another fad, or is there something really to this?
It's definitely more than a fad. Functional foods are those that provide benefits beyond just basic nutrition.
Okay, so it's not just about calories or macros.
Right. They contain compounds that have actually been linked to specific health outcomes, like reducing the risk of chronic diseases or even improving cognitive function.
So it's like food that does double duty.
Mm,
It nourishes your body and gives you an extra health boost.
you got it. And there are two main types of functional foods.
Lay it on me.
Natural and modified natural functional foods are things like berries, fatty fish, nuts, and seeds. Just good stuff we should already be eating anyway. They're just naturally packed with beneficial compounds.
Okay, but what makes them functional? I mean, berries are delicious, but what makes them stand out from, say, a candy bar?
Well, for example, berries are rich in antioxidants, which can help protect your cells from damage. And they might actually reduce your risk of chronic diseases like cancer and heart disease.
Oh, I see. So it's about those extra compounds that have specific effects on the body.
Right. And another great example is fatty fish,
Yeah.
like salmon or mackerel.
Oh, yeah, those are good for the brain, right?
They are. They're a great source of omega-3 fatty acids, which are important for brain health, heart health, and even reducing inflammation.
I've heard that blueberries are good for memory. Is there any truth to that?
No, there is. Studies actually suggest that those antioxidants in blueberries might improve memory and cognitive function.
Really? Maybe I should start having blueberries with my breakfast every morning.
It couldn't hurt. And then you've got things like nuts and seeds, which were packed with healthy fats, fiber, and protein.
Okay, so lots of good examples of natural functional foods. But what about those modified functional foods you mentioned? What are those all about?
So modified functional foods have had specific ingredients added to them to enhance their health benefits. Think about calcium-fortified orange juice or yogurt with added probiotics.
Oh, right. I've seen those at the store.
They're everywhere, and they can be a great way to boost your intake of certain nutrients, especially if you're not getting enough from your diet alone.
So they're getting a little extra help in the health department?
Exactly. But this is where it can get a bit tricky, especially for someone like Paul who's new to managing his own nutrition.
Yeah, I can see how that would be confusing, trying to figure out what's been added and why.
Right. He might not even realize the benefits he's getting from those modified functional foods. And this is where clear labeling in education becomes super important.
That makes sense. It's like a whole hidden layer of information that he needs to learn how to decode.
Exactly. And speaking of decoding, let's talk about organic foods.
Ooh, yeah. The organic craze is everywhere these days.
It is. But what does that label actually mean? And is it really worth the extra cost?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people, myself included, are a bit fuzzy on the details.
Yeah, and it can be confusing because organic is kind of this catch-all term that gets thrown around a lot. But in the U.S., the USDA has actually established 4 official categories for organic labeling, and it all comes down to the percentage of organic ingredients.
Okay, so there are levels to this.
There are. The highest level is 100% organic, meaning every single ingredient except for things like water and salt is certified organic, no synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, or GMOs allowed.
Wow, that's strict. So that's the gold standard of organic. What about the other categories?
So the next one down is just plain organic, which means at least 95% of the ingredients have to be certified organic.
Okay, so still pretty high.
Right. Then you've got made with organic ingredients, which means at least 70% of the ingredients meet those standards. And finally, there's contains organic, which basically means less than 70% of the ingredients are actually organic.
So there's a whole spectrum. It's important to actually pay attention to those labels and understand the nuances. But let's get to the heart of the matter. Are organic foods actually safer and more nutritious? Like, is it worth spending the extra money?
That's the big question, right? And it's not as straightforward as you might think. When it comes to safety, people often perceive organic foods as being safer, but that's not always true.
Wait, really? So even organic produce could be contaminated?
It's possible. Yeah, you see, organic standards don't necessarily address all safety issues like microbial or chemical hazards. There have even been outbreaks linked to organic foods in recent years.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's surprising. So why is that happening? I thought organic meant pesticide-free.
Well, it's not always pesticide-free. Organic farmers can use certain approved pesticides,
Ah.
and also organic farming practices often involve using natural fertilizers like manure.
Okay, I see. And manure, if not handled properly, can carry pathogens.
Exactly. So regardless of whether it's organic or conventionally grown, all food needs to be handled and prepared safely.
Absolutely. Hand washing, proper storage, cooking food thoroughly.
Yeah.
Those are non-negotiables.
Exactly, no matter what kind of food you're eating. But let's talk about the nutritional value. Do organic foods actually have a nutritional advantage?
Yeah, that's what a lot of people think, right? That organic equals more nutrients.
It's a common belief, but the research is actually a bit mixed. Some studies suggest that organic produce may have higher levels of certain nutrients like vitamin C and antioxidants.
Okay, so there's a possibility.
Yeah, but those differences are often pretty small, and they may not actually have a significant impact on your overall health.
So it's not a guarantee that organic equals more nutritious, but there's a chance.
Exactly. And the research is still ongoing, so we're learning more all the time. But there's one interesting tidbit I came across.
Ooh, tell me.
Organic animal products, like meat and milk, tend to have higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids.
Interesting. So if you're looking to boost your omega-3s, organic might be the way to go for animal products.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
But even if the nutritional differences are minimal, a lot of people choose organic because they're worried about pesticides.
Right. And that's a valid concern. Nobody wants to be eating a salad full of chemicals.
No, for sure. And there's no denying that organic farming practices generally result in lower pesticide residues on food. But this is where those dirty dozen and clean 15 lists come in handy.
Ah, yes. The handy-dandy lists that tell you which fruits and veggies are worth buying organic because they tend to have higher pesticide levels.
Exactly. So if you're concerned about pesticide exposure, prioritizing organic options for items on the dirty dozen list is a good strategy.
Makes sense. But what about the clean 15? Those are the ones that are usually okay to buy conventionally grown, right?
Right. Those are the fruits and vegetables that typically have very low pesticide residues, even when they're grown conventionally. So you can save some money and still feel good about choosing those options.
Okay, so this is super helpful information, especially for someone like Paul who's on a limited budget.
It is. He might be avoiding all produce because of pesticide fears, but knowing about the Clean 15 could actually encourage him to include those healthy options without breaking the bank.
Right. It's about making informed choices and finding that balance between cost and potential benefits.
Exactly. And these lists can be a great tool for that.
Well, we've officially demystified the organic myth and learned some savvy shopping tips. But now let's get real about a serious topic, foodborne illness.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. And
Yeah.
something that we all need to be aware of, but especially those of us going into healthcare. We need to be able to educate our patients and keep them safe.
You're absolutely right. And it's a bigger problem than many people realize. Millions of Americans get sick from foodborne illnesses every year.
Wow, really? Millions?
Yep. And it leads to thousands of hospitalizations and even deaths. It's not something to take lightly.
Definitely not. But before we dive into prevention, let's talk about the culprits behind these foodborne illnesses. What are the main offenders?
So over 90% of the illnesses and outbreaks are caused by just 4 pathogens.
4. Okay, I'm ready. Name them.
Salmonella, norovirus, Campylobacter, and Clostridium perfringens.
Okay, so those are the big 4. And while less common, Listeria is another one to watch out for. Right?
Yes, especially for pregnant women, older adults, and people with weakened immune systems. Listeria can be very dangerous.
Got it. So we've got our list of foodborne villains, but what are the telltale signs that someone might actually be dealing with a foodborne illness?
Well, the symptoms can actually be pretty similar to the stomach flu, which can make it tricky to pinpoint the cause.
Oh, no, that doesn't sound fun.
No, not at all. We're talking about diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, fever, abdominal cramps, headaches. You know, the usual suspects.
Okay, so not a party in your stomach. But when should someone actually seek medical attention?
So most cases of foodborne illness actually do resolve on their own within a few days. But if you experience bloody diarrhea, a stiff neck with a really bad headache and fever, or persistent vomiting and diarrhea that's leading to dehydration, it's important to see a doctor right away.
Got it. So those are the red flags. But what can we do to prevent these nasty bugs from crashing our dinner parties in the first place?
The good news is that prevention is key. And our sources emphasize 4 really important steps. Hand washing, avoiding cross-contamination, cooking food thoroughly, and chilling those leftovers promptly.
Okay, those sound like the basic rules of Food Safety 101. But let's break them down a bit for our listeners, especially those who might be new to this. First up, Hand washing seems simple enough, but what's the proper technique?
You'd be surprised how many people don't actually wash their hands properly. The key is to use soap and water and scrub for at least 20 seconds. Make sure you're getting all those nooks and crannies under your fingernails between your fingers.
So it's not just a quick rinse under the faucet.
Nope. It's gotta be thorough. And it's not just before meals, it's also after using the restroom, before and after handling raw meat, poultry, seafood, or eggs. And anytime you touch something that could be harboring bacteria, basically.
When in doubt, wash your hands.
You got it. It's such a simple thing, but it makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about cross-contamination. That's another one that seems straightforward, but it's easy to make mistakes.
It is. You're in a hurry, you're not paying attention, and suddenly those raw chicken juices are all over your cutting board.
Ew. Not a good look.
Not at all. And that's how those nasty bacteria spread. So one of the biggest things is to use separate cutting boards for raw meat and produce.
Okay, so raw meat gets its own designated board. No sharing allowed.
Exactly. And don't forget about washing your utensils' countertops and even serving platters after they've touched raw meat. You want to make sure you're not spreading those germs around.
So basically, treat raw meat like it's carrying a contagious disease because, in a way, it is.
That's a great way to put it. And whatever you do not reuse marinades that have been in contact with raw meat.
Okay, no double dipping with the marinade. Got it.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about cooking. I know I'm guilty of sometimes eyeballing it, but I think our sources are pretty clear on this one. Cook food thoroughly.
Absolutely. And when we say thoroughly, we mean using a food thermometer to actually make sure it reaches that safe internal temperature.
Okay, so no more guessing games when it comes to doneness. Get yourself a thermometer and use it.
You got it. It's the best way to make sure you're killing those harmful bacteria. And last but not least, chilling leftovers promptly. This is where our friend Paul from earlier made a classic food safety blunder. He was cooking a big pot of chili and just reheating it for days on end.
Oh yeah, that's a no-no. What's the golden rule for leftovers?
Ideally, you want to chill them within 2 hours of cooking, and when you reheat them, make sure they're piping hot all the way through.
Okay, great tips. Now let's shift gears and delve into a topic that's often surrounded by controversy. Food biotechnology, better known as genetically modified organisms or GMOs.
Ah, yes, GMOs. The topic that always seems to spark a lively debate.
For sure. They're everywhere these days, but there's a lot of fear and misinformation swirling around them. So let's try to demystify the science behind them. What exactly does it mean for a food to be genetically modified?
In simple terms, it involves taking a gene with a desirable trait from one plant and inserting it into another. Like, you could take a gene that makes a plant resistant to pests and insert it into a different plant to make it pest-resistant too.
So it's kind of like giving plants a genetic upgrade.
You could say that. It's a more targeted and predictable approach compared to traditional crossbreeding, which has been used for centuries to develop new plant varieties.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some examples of GMOs that we might encounter in our everyday lives? I feel like they're lurking everywhere.
The most common GMO crops in the U.S. are corn, cotton, soybeans, and alfalfa. Over 90% of these crops are genetically modified.
Wow, so GMOs are way more prevalent in our food supply than most people realize.
Absolutely. And the ingredients derived from these crops end up in a wide range of processed foods, too.
So they're kind of hiding in plain sight.
In a way, yes. And they're not just limited to food, either. Biotechnology has also led to some breakthroughs in healthcare, like the development of insulin for people with diabetes.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. So there are definitely some potential benefits to GMOs. But what about the concerns people have, especially regarding their health? I mean, are they safe to eat?
That's where things get a bit complicated. There's a lot of fear surrounding GMOs, with concerns ranging from changes in nutritional content to the creation of allergens to potential toxic effects.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in those what-if scenarios when you hear the words genetically modified.
I understand the concerns, but it's really important to look at the evidence. And major health organizations like the American Medical Association, the National Academy of Sciences, and even the World Health Organization, they've all endorsed the responsible use of genetic engineering based on extensive research.
So the scientific consensus is that GMOs are safe for human consumption.
Yes. There's no evidence to suggest that GMOs are any riskier than conventionally grown foods. But I think it's important to acknowledge that public perception often lags behind scientific understanding.
That's true. Fear can be a powerful force, especially when it comes to something as personal as the food we eat.
Absolutely. But let's address some of the specific concerns people have. One common worry is that GMOs might trigger allergic reactions.
Yeah, that's a valid concern, especially for people with food allergies.
For sure. But every single new food, whether it's GMO or conventionally bred, undergoes really rigorous testing to assess its allergenic potential. And so far, there's no evidence to suggest that GMOs are any more likely to cause allergies than other foods.
Okay, that's reassuring. Another concern I've heard is that GMOs could damage our organs or disrupt our bodily functions.
That's another one that comes up a lot. And again, the evidence just doesn't support those fears. Numerous studies have looked into the potential toxicity of GMOs, and they've consistently found no negative impacts on organ health.
So our livers and kidneys are safe.
Safe and sound. And then there's a fear that consuming GMOs could somehow alter our own genes.
Yeah, that one sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? But rest assured, that's not how genetics works. There's just no evidence to suggest that genes from GMOs can actually transfer to humans or change our DNA.
Okay, so we can cross becoming part tomato off our list of worries.
Exactly. I think a lot of the fear surrounding GMOs stems from this idea that we're somehow messing with nature in a way that could have unpredictable consequences. But the truth is, humans have been modifying plants and animals for centuries through selective breeding. Genetic engineering is just a more precise and efficient way of doing that.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the environmental impact of GMOs? That's a big concern for a lot of people.
You're right. That's a really important consideration, and it's a complex issue. One of the main concerns revolves around the use of herbicides, particularly glyphosate.
Ah, yes, glyphosate. I know that's been linked to some health concerns and is widely used in conjunction with GMO crops.
Exactly. And the problem is that the over-reliance on glyphosate has actually led to the emergence of herbicide-resistant weeds.
Superweeds. We talked about those earlier.
Yes. And it creates this vicious cycle where farmers end up having to use even stronger, more toxic herbicides to try to control these resistant weeds. And that has some serious implications for the environment.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem.
Right. It can lead to water contamination, soil degradation, and it can harm beneficial insects and wildlife. So the environmental impact of GMOs is definitely something we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. But are GMOs themselves bad for the environment? Or is it more about how they're used?
That's a great question. And it's a nuanced issue. GMOs themselves aren't inherently bad for the environment. In fact, they have the potential to actually reduce pesticide use overall if they're managed responsibly.
Right, because some GMO crops are engineered to be resistant to certain pests, which could decrease the need for insecticides.
Exactly. And there are other potential environmental benefits too, like scientists are developing crops that are more drought tolerant or that can thrive in salty soils. These innovations could help address some of the challenges we're facing with climate change and food security.
So there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the environmental impact of GMOs. It's not a black and white issue. There are both potential benefits and risks to consider.
Exactly. And it's an area where we need more sustainable solutions and more responsible use of this technology. But what about consumers who want to make informed choices about GMOs? Are GMOs labeled?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because if they're not labeled, how do you even know what you're buying?
Well, in the United States, there's now a national mandatory standard for disclosing foods that are bioengineered.
Bioengineered. So is that just a fancy word for GMO?
Pretty much. The USDA defines bioengineered foods as those that contain detectable genetic material that's been modified through certain lab techniques and can't be created through conventional breeding.
So if a food contains GMOs, it has to be labeled.
Exactly. And the mandatory compliance date for this labeling law is January 1, 2022. So we're getting there.
That's good to know. So how can consumers tell if a product contains GMOs? Is there a specific symbol or wording to look for?
Yeah, you'll typically see a symbol that states derived from bioengineering or a statement that the product contains ingredients derived from bioengineering.
Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. But what about foods that don't contain any detectable modified genetic material? Are those exempt from labeling?
Yep. Those products might still use ingredients that are derived from GMO crops, but since they've been processed or refined, they won't necessarily carry that bioengineered label.
Got it. So there's a bit of nuance to the labeling, but at least consumers have more transparency now. Now, let's move on to another hot topic in the food industry. Antibiotics in the food supply.
Ooh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
It is, and I think it's an area where consumer concerns are totally justified. The overuse of antibiotics in livestock has contributed to the growing problem of antibiotic resistance, which is a major threat to public health.
You're absolutely right. It's a huge problem, and it's something that we, as future healthcare professionals, need to understand.
Okay, so break it down for us. Why were antibiotics so widely used in animals in the first place?
Historically, antibiotics were routinely given to livestock, even healthy animals, for a few different reasons. They were used to promote growth, increase feed efficiency, and basically prevent diseases in those crowded and often unsanitary living conditions that a lot of farm animals are raised in.
So basically, it was a way to maximize production, but at what cost?
Exactly. And unfortunately, that cost is huge. This widespread use of antibiotics created the perfect breeding ground for antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
And those resistant bacteria can jump from animals to humans, right?
Yes, they can make their way into the human food chain through a few different pathways.
Oh no, that sounds scary. How does that happen?
Well, when animals are slaughtered, those antibiotic-resistant bacteria from their gut can contaminate the meat. And manure from those animals can contaminate irrigation water, which can end up on fruits and vegetables.
So even if we're not eating meat, we could still be exposed to these resistant bacteria.
Unfortunately, yes. And this is a big deal because when those resistant bacteria infect humans, they're much harder to treat with conventional antibiotics.
So it's like this domino effect with the overuse of antibiotics in animals ultimately impacting human health.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that our health is really interconnected with the health of our environment and the animals we share it with. But the good news is that there have been some positive changes in recent years to address this issue.
Oh, that's good to hear. What are some of those changes?
Well, since January 2017, federal regulations have actually prohibited the use of antibiotics in adult animals for the purpose of just promoting weight gain.
Okay, so they're cracking down on that practice.
They are, and now a veterinarian's approval is actually required before using antibiotics that are considered medically important for humans.
So there are more checks and balances in place.
Exactly, and that's a step in the right direction. But what about those antibiotic-free labels we see on meat and poultry? Do those actually guarantee that the animals weren't given any antibiotics?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because it seems like every food label is trying to make some kind of health claim these days.
It's true, and unfortunately, the term antibiotic-free isn't actually officially defined, so it's not always clear what it means.
So it could be a bit of a marketing ploy.
It's possible, yeah. All meat and poultry in the U.S. actually has to meet certain safety standards to make sure there are no antibiotic residues present before slaughter. So technically, all meat could be considered antibiotic-free in that sense.
Ah, I see. So that label might not be as meaningful as consumers think.
Exactly. And even if an animal wasn't given antibiotics, it could still carry those antibiotic-resistant bacteria in its gut.
So how can consumers who are concerned about antibiotic use make informed choices? What should they be looking for?
The organic label is a good indicator. Organic livestock can only receive antibiotics for treatment purposes, and they have to be raised without antibiotics for growth promotion.
Okay, so organic is a more reliable indicator in this case.
Yes. And you might also see labels like raised without antibiotics, no antibiotics ever, or never given antibiotics. These labels usually mean that no antibiotics were used at any point in the animal's life.
Okay, so there are options out there for consumers who want to avoid meat and poultry raised with antibiotics. Now, let's tackle another topic that often raises eyebrows. Food irradiation.
Ooh, yes. This one's interesting.
It is. It's kind of a mystery to me. I've heard the term before, but I'm not sure I fully understand what it entails.
So food irradiation involves treating food with controlled doses of ionizing radiation, like gamma rays, electron beams, or X-rays.
Radiation. Okay, that sounds a little scary. Is irradiated food actually safe to eat?
I know the word radiation can sound alarming, but it's actually a very safe and effective technology when it's used properly.
Okay, but how does it work? And what does it actually do to the food?
So the radiation passes through the food kind of like an X-ray, and it eliminates those harmful bacteria, parasites, and insects. This helps reduce the risk of foodborne illness, and it can also extend the shelf life of food.
So it's like a sanitizing process.
And
But it doesn't make the food radioactive, right?
That's a common misconception. But no, it doesn't make the food radioactive. The radiation just passes through the food and it doesn't leave any residue behind.
Okay, that's good to know. But what about the taste and nutritional value of irradiated food? Does it change those?
That's a great question. And surprisingly, food irradiation doesn't really alter the taste, texture, or appearance of food all that much.
So it's not like those weird glow-in-the-dark vegetables you see in cartoons.
Nope. It's more similar to pasteurization or freezing. It's a way to preserve food quality and safety without making major changes to the sensory experience.
Okay, so it's not like you're eating some strange mutated food. But what about the nutrients? Are there any losses?
There might be a slight decrease in certain nutrients like thiamine, but the losses are generally minimal and they're comparable to what you'd see with other food preservation methods like cooking or freezing.
So it's not stripping the food of its nutritional value.
Exactly. And another benefit is that irradiation can actually help prevent food spoilage, which can reduce food waste.
Oh, that's great. So it's a win-win for consumers and for the environment.
Exactly. But what about labeling? How can consumers know if a food has been irradiated?
Yeah, because I've never really noticed any special labels for irradiated foods.
You're right, it's not always obvious. But federal law actually requires irradiated foods to be labeled with the international symbol for irradiation. It's called the Redora symbol.
The Redora symbol. Okay, what does that look like?
It's a green, flower-like symbol with the words treated with irradiation or treated by irradiation.
Okay, I'll have to keep an eye out for that next time I'm at the grocery store. Now, let's shift gears and discuss a topic that's often overlooked, but critically important: food access.
Ah, yes. Food access. This is a huge issue with far-reaching implications for...
It is. It has far-reaching implications for public health and equity.
Absolutely. Access to healthy, affordable food is essential for everyone. But unfortunately, that's not a reality for a lot of people here in the U.S.
You're right, and that's where those concepts of food insecurity and food deserts come into play.
Okay, so let's define those terms. What does it actually mean to be food insecure? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around that term.
Yeah, food insecurity basically refers to a lack of consistent access to enough food for an active, healthy life.
So it's not just about being hungry sometimes. It's about not knowing where your next meal is coming from or having to skip meals because you can't afford food. Exactly. It's a situation where people are worried about running out of food or they're unable to afford balanced meals, or even having to choose between buying food and paying for other essential needs like housing or medication.
Wow, that sounds incredibly stressful and just disheartening. How widespread is food insecurity in the U.S.?
It's more common than you might think. In 2018, an estimated 11.1% of U.S. households actually experienced food insecurity at some point during the year.
Wow, that's over 1 in 10 households.
It is, and certain groups are disproportionately affected, including households with incomes near or below the poverty line, households with children, Black and Hispanic-headed households, and those living in urban areas.
So it's not just about individual choices. There are systemic factors at play that are contributing to food insecurity.
Absolutely. It's about poverty. It's about lack of access to affordable housing. It's about transportation challenges. It's about systemic racism and discrimination.
It's about all those things coming together to create these barriers to healthy food.
Exactly. And that brings us to the concept of food deserts.
Okay, so what exactly is a food desert? Because I've heard that term thrown around a lot, but I'm not always sure what people mean by it.
So a food desert is basically an area where people have very limited access to affordable and nutritious food.
So not just any food, but healthy food.
Yeah.
Like fresh fruits and vegetables, lean protein, whole grains, those kinds of things.
Exactly. It's often defined as living more than a mile away from a supermarket in an urban area or more than 10 miles away in a rural area.
So if you don't have reliable transportation, or you can't afford to travel long distances to get to a grocery store with healthy options, you're basically stuck.
Right. And this lack of access can have a huge impact on people's diets and their overall health. People living in food deserts are much more likely to rely on convenience stores and fast food restaurants, which tend to offer cheaper but less healthy options.
It's like a vicious cycle. Limited access to healthy food contributes to poor diet and health outcomes, which can then make it even harder to break out of poverty and access those resources.
You're absolutely right, and it's a complex issue with no easy solutions. But understanding the challenges people face in accessing healthy food is a crucial first step in addressing this problem.
Absolutely. It's something that we as future healthcare providers need to be aware of so we can advocate for our patients and our communities.
Yes. And it's not just about advocating for policy changes, it's also about providing practical support and guidance to our patients.
Right.
Helping them find resources like food banks or community gardens.
Right. It's about meeting people where they are and providing support that's tailored to their individual needs.
Exactly. And it's also about educating ourselves about the factors that contribute to food insecurity and food desert so we can be better advocates for change.
I think that's a great point. It's not just about handing out pamphlets on healthy eating. It's about addressing those underlying social and economic factors that are creating these barriers.
Exactly. It's about taking a holistic approach and understanding that food access is a complex issue with multiple layers.
Well said. Now let's shift gears a bit and circle back to those savvy shopping tips we were discussing earlier, specifically those Dirty Dozen and Clean 15 lists.
Oh, yes. Those are such valuable tools for making informed choices about produce, especially if you're on a budget or concerned about pesticide exposure.
They are. And I think they can be especially helpful for patients who are trying to eat healthy, but who might be overwhelmed by all the options and all the information out there.
Absolutely. As nurses, we can actually share those lists with our patients and explain how to use them to make healthy and affordable choices. Like, you can suggest that they prioritize organic options for the items on the Dirty Dozen list.
Right, because those are the ones that tend to have the highest pesticide residue.
Exactly. And then they can save money by choosing conventionally grown options for the items on the Clean 15 list.
That's a great idea. It's a simple but effective way to empower patients to make healthier choices without feeling restricted or overwhelmed.
Exactly. And it's just one example of how we can use our knowledge of nutrition to provide practical, actionable advice.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on topics like organic foods, GMOs, food safety, and food access. But there's one more area I want to touch on before we wrap up, and that's food irradiation.
Ah, yes. Food irradiation, the often misunderstood hero of food safety.
I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Ah.
Misunderstood. I know you explained the process earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting because it's such a valuable tool for preventing foodborne illness.
You're absolutely right, and I think it's especially relevant for nursing students because you'll likely encounter patients who have questions or concerns about it. So let's do a quick recap. Food irradiation basically involves exposing food to a controlled dose of ionizing radiation.
Like gamma rays, electron beams, or X-rays, those kind of things.
Exactly. And this radiation can actually kill harmful bacteria, parasites, and insects, which helps reduce the risk of foodborne illness, and it can also extend the shelf life of food.
Okay, but just to clarify, this process doesn't make the food radioactive, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a big fear for a lot of people.
It is a common fear, but no, it doesn't make the food radioactive. The radiation passes through the food kind of like an X-ray, and it eliminates those pathogens, but it doesn't linger in the food itself.
It's kind of like passing your luggage through an X-ray scanner at the airport. The scanner detects those potentially harmful items, but it doesn't make your luggage radioactive.
That's a great analogy. And food irradiation has actually been endorsed by major health organizations, including the World Health Organization, the CDC, and the USDA. It's been rigorously studied and proven to be a safe and effective way to make our food safer.
Okay, so that's reassuring. But what about the impact on the food itself? Does it change the taste or the nutritional value?
Good question. And one of the things that surprised me when I was researching this is that food irradiation doesn't really alter the taste, texture, or appearance of food very much at all.
It's just not like you're getting some weird glow-in-the-dark frankenfood.
Nope, not at all. It's really similar to other preservation methods like pasteurization or freezing. It's just a way to preserve the quality and safety of food without making major changes to the sensory experience.
Okay, so it's not like you're eating some strange mutated food. But what about the nutrient content? Are there any losses?
There might be a slight decrease in certain nutrients like thiamine, but the losses are generally pretty minimal and comparable to what you'd see with other cooking or preservation methods.
Okay, so it's not stripping the food of its nutritional value, but if it's such a great tool for food safety, why isn't it more widely used?
That's a great question. I think part of it is just public perception. The word radiation tends to scare people, even though the process itself is perfectly safe. And then there are some logistical challenges, like the cost of setting up irradiation facilities and the need for clear labeling to inform consumers.
Right. You mentioned labeling earlier. How can consumers tell if a food has been irradiated?
So irradiated foods are required to carry the Radura symbol, which is that green flower-like icon with the words treated with irradiation or treated by irradiation.
Okay, so keep an eye out for that Radura symbol if you're curious about whether a food has been irradiated. But shifting gears a bit, I think it's worth mentioning that as future nurses, we're not just going to be dealing with patients who are making their own food choices at home. We'll also be working with patients who are relying on hospitals or other healthcare facilities for their meals.
That's a really important point, and it highlights the crucial role that healthcare institutions play in ensuring food safety and promoting healthy eating habits.
Absolutely. So what are some of the key things that hospitals and other healthcare facilities need to be focusing on when it comes to food and nutrition?
Well, first and foremost, they need to have really rigorous food safety protocols in place to prevent foodborne illnesses. And this includes everything from proper food handling and storage to making sure food is cooked thoroughly and that temperatures are controlled properly.
Right. Especially for patients who are already vulnerable or immunocompromised. Foodborne illness can be really dangerous.
Exactly. And beyond just preventing illness, hospitals also have a responsibility to provide meals that are nutritious and appealing.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a challenge to cater to so many different dietary needs and preferences.
It is, but it's so important to make sure that patients are getting the nutrients they need to heal and recover. So hospitals need to offer a variety of options, including vegetarian, vegan, and culturally appropriate meals.
And let's not forget about portion control.
Oh, yes. That's a big one. It's about finding that balance between providing enough food to nourish patients and preventing overeating, which can be a problem, especially for patients who are less active.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important for hospitals to educate patients about healthy eating habits, both during their stay and when they're transitioning back home.
I agree. This could involve providing nutrition counseling, offering cooking classes, or just sharing resources on healthy recipes and meal planning.
It's all about empowering patients to make informed choices that support their health and well-being, even after they leave the hospital.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that we, as healthcare professionals, we're not immune to the challenges of making healthy choices. We're all bombarded with the same conflicting information, the same temptations, and we all have the same time constraints.
It's true. We're human, just like our patients.
Exactly. And I think acknowledging that makes us more relatable and more empathetic. It allows us to approach these conversations with humility and understanding rather than judgment or superiority.
That's a really important point. It's about building trust and rapport with our patients and working together to find solutions that actually work for them. But speaking of solutions, I think it's time for us to tackle that elephant in the room, genetically modified organisms, or GMOs.
Ah, yes, GMOs, the topic that always seems to stir up controversy.
For sure. We touched on some of the health and environmental concerns earlier, but I think it's worth delving a little deeper, especially since there are so many myths and misconceptions floating around.
You're absolutely right. It's an area where fear and misinformation often overshadow the scientific evidence. So let's try to separate fact from fiction and provide our listeners with a more balanced perspective.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Can you remind us again what it means for a food to be genetically modified? What's actually happening at a scientific level?
Sure. It basically involves manipulating the genes of an organism, usually a plant, to introduce a specific trait. Like, you could modify a plant to make it more resistant to pests or more tolerant to herbicides.
So it's like giving the plant a genetic advantage.
Exactly. And it's a technology that has actually been used for decades to improve crop yields, enhance nutritional value, and even develop new medicines.
So if it's been around for so long and it has so much potential, why all the controversy? What are people so afraid of?
Well, I think a lot of it stems from a lack of understanding about how genetic modification actually works. And there's this fear of the unknown, right? There are concerns about potential health risks like allergies or toxicity. And then there are concerns about the environmental impact, like the development of those superweeds we were talking about earlier, or the loss of biodiversity.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in those what-if scenarios and imagine all sorts of worst-case scenarios.
Absolutely. But I think it's so important to approach this topic with a critical eye and look at the evidence. And the overwhelming consensus from the scientific community is that GMOs are safe for human consumption, and they don't pose any greater risks than conventionally grown foods.
So all those scary stories about frankenfoods and mutated vegetables are just that story.
For the most part, yes. Of course, it's important to acknowledge that there are valid concerns about the potential for unintended consequences with any new technology. And genetic modification is no exception. But those concerns need to be balanced against the potential benefits, and they need to be addressed through rigorous testing and oversight.
Okay, so it's about weighing the risks and benefits and making informed choices based on evidence, not fear. But what about the environmental concerns? Those seem a bit more tangible than the health concerns.
That's a fair point. And the environmental impact of GMOs is definitely something we need to be mindful of. As we talked about earlier, one of the main concerns is the overuse of herbicides like glyphosate, which has led to the development of herbicide-resistant weeds.
Right, it's that arms race in the fields we were discussing earlier.
Exactly, and that's a legitimate concern that needs to be addressed through more sustainable farming practices like crop rotation and integrated pest management.
So it's not about demonizing GMOs as being inherently bad for the environment, but rather about using them responsibly and minimizing any potential negative impacts.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that GMOs also have the potential to benefit the environment. For example, some GMO crops are actually engineered to be more drought tolerant, which could reduce the need for irrigation and help conserve water resources.
Oh, that's interesting. So they could actually be part of the solution to some of our environmental challenges.
Exactly. And other GMO crops are designed to require less fertilizer, which can minimize runoff and water pollution. So there's a lot of potential there.
Okay, so there are both potential benefits and risks to consider when it comes to the environmental impact of GMOs. It's not a simple black and white issue.
It's definitely nuanced, and it requires a thoughtful and balanced approach. But as future nurses, I think it's so important for us to understand these complexities so we can have informed conversations with our patients.
I agree. It's about being advocates for science and reason and helping people make choices that are aligned with their own values and priorities. But speaking of making choices, what about consumers who want to avoid GMOs altogether? Is that even possible in today's world?
It's definitely challenging given how widespread GMOs are in our food supply. But there are a few things consumers can do to minimize their exposure.
Okay, like what?
Well, one option is to choose organic foods, since GMOs are prohibited in organic agriculture.
Right. We talked about organic labeling earlier and how important it is to understand those different categories.
Right.
But are there other options for people who might not be able to afford organic food all the time?
Absolutely. Another option is to look for the Non-GMO Project Verified seal.
Oh yeah, I've seen that label before. What does that actually mean?
It's basically a third-party certification program that verifies products that meet certain standards for GMO avoidance. So it's like a little extra assurance for consumers who are concerned about GMOs.
So it's not a guarantee that the product is completely GMO-free, but it means that the company has taken steps to avoid using GMO ingredients.
Exactly. And it's becoming increasingly common to see this label on a wide variety of products, from packaged foods to produce to even supplements.
That's good to know. It gives consumers more power to make informed choices. But shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about a topic that I think is particularly relevant for nursing students: communicating about nutrition with patients.
Oh, yes. That's a crucial skill for any healthcare professional. And it's one that requires not just knowledge of nutrition, but also some really strong communication skills.
Absolutely. So what are some tips for having effective conversations about nutrition with patients? Because it can be a sensitive topic, and it's easy to come across as judgmental or preachy.
You're right. It's definitely a delicate balance. I think one of the most important things is to meet patients where they are.
What do you mean by that?
Don't assume that everyone has the same level of knowledge or understanding about nutrition. And don't assume that everyone is ready or willing to make changes to their diet.
Right. It's about tailoring our approach to each individual patient's needs and circumstances, and recognizing that everyone is on their own journey.
Exactly. And it's also crucial to be respectful and non-judgmental. People have a lot of different beliefs and attitudes about food, and it's not our job to try to force our own opinions on them.
That's a good point. It's about providing guidance and support, not dictating what people should or shouldn't eat.
Exactly. And I think it's also helpful to focus on the positive. Rather than just telling people what not to eat, let's highlight the benefits of healthy eating and empower them to make choices that support their overall well-being.
I love that. It's about shifting the focus from deprivation to abundance and making healthy eating feel more appealing and achievable.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to be realistic. We all have busy lives, and it's not always possible to make perfect choices 100% of the time.
It's true. It's about finding ways to incorporate healthy habits into our daily routines in a way that's sustainable and enjoyable.
Absolutely. And I think as future nurses, we have a unique opportunity to be role models for healthy eating.
That's true. We can walk the walk and talk the talk.
Yeah.
And hopefully that will inspire our patients to do the same.
Exactly. And it all starts with education. The more we learn about nutrition, the better equipped we'll be to have these conversations with confidence and compassion.
Well said. And I think that's a great segue into the final topic I wanted to discuss today: the importance of staying up to date on the latest research and recommendations in the field of nutrition.
Oh, yes. That is absolutely crucial. Nutrition is such a dynamic and evolving field, and what we know today might be different tomorrow.
It's true. I remember learning about the food pyramid in school, and now it's all about my plate. It's constantly changing.
Exactly. There are constantly new studies being published, new guidelines being released, and new trends emerging. It can be hard to keep up. but it's so important for us to stay informed so we can provide our patients with the best possible care.
So how do we do that? Where do we even go to find reliable and credible information about nutrition? Because there's so much out there, it's overwhelming.
There are definitely a lot of resources out there, but one of my favorites is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. They have a website that's packed with evidence-based information on all sorts of nutrition topics. And they also have a directory of registered dietitian nutritionists, so you can actually find an expert in your area if you need personalized advice.
That's a great tip. What about government agencies? Do they have any resources on nutrition?
Absolutely. The USDA and the FDA are both great sources of information on food safety nutrition guidelines and food labeling. They have websites and publications that are super easy to understand and access.
Okay, so we've got professional organizations, government agencies. What about other sources like books or websites? How do we know if those are reliable? Because there's so much misinformation out there.
That's where those critical thinking skills come in handy. You always want to look at the author's credentials, the date of publication, and where they're getting their information. If a website is trying to sell you something, that's a red flag. And if the information sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Right. It's all about being a savvy consumer of information and not just believing everything you read or hear. But even with all these resources available, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's still a lot we don't know about nutrition.
That's so true. It's such a complex and ever-evolving field, and there's always more to learn.
I think that's what makes it so fascinating. Right. It's a journey of discovery, and we're all in it together.
I couldn't agree more. And I think as future nurses, we have a responsibility to approach this journey with curiosity, humility, and a commitment to lifelong learning.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on for this part of our deep dive into food and nutrition.
It really has been a wild ride, hasn't it?
It has. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive into the world of food and nutrition.
It's incredible just how much there is to learn about food and how it all circles back to health and healthcare.
It really highlights that food is way more than just like fuel.
So much more. It's about our health, our well-being, our culture, even economics.
And it impacts every single one of us, no matter your background, your job, anything.
Speaking of jobs, I think this deep dive has been super insightful for all those future nurses out there listening.
Totally. We've gone over everything from figuring out those tricky food labels and the whole organic thing to understanding GMOs and how we can advocate for better food security.
And we really dug deep into the importance of critical thinking, making evidence-based choices, and communicating clearly about nutrition, especially with patients.
We've given everyone a lot to chew on.
Hopefully it's left everyone feeling a little more empowered, maybe even inspired to keep learning about food and nutrition.
It's a fascinating field, that's for sure. One of the big takeaways for me is that as future nurses, we have a real chance to make a difference in people's lives when it comes to food.
Yeah, we can step up and be educators, advocates, even role models to help our patients navigate the world of food and make choices that are good for them.
And how do we do that?
We stay informed, we stay curious, and we stay engaged in the conversations happening around food.
Because at the end of the day, we're trying to create a healthier and more sustainable food system for everyone.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating to me how all these topics that seem so different, GMOs, organic food, food safety, food access, they're all connected.
Feels like threads in a tapestry.
Yes, they all come together to create this complex picture of our food system.
And as healthcare professionals, we have a front row seat to see how it all works, all that interconnectedness.
We're like detectives, gathering clues to solve a big mystery.
Except the mystery we're trying to solve is how to create a healthier, more equitable food system for everyone.
And the clues are everywhere. From the science behind GMOs to the policies around food access to the choices we make at the grocery store every single day.
It's an investigation that never really ends, and it needs people from all different backgrounds and areas of expertise working together.
But I think the good news is that there's more and more awareness about these issues. And there's a movement happening, a movement towards finding real solutions.
And that's where we, as future nurses, can really step up and make a difference.
We can use our knowledge, our passion for health, and our commitment to equity to be a part of that change.
Advocate for better policies, empower our patients, and maybe even inspire a whole new generation of healthcare professionals who are passionate about food.
That's a powerful vision. And it all starts with being willing to learn, to ask questions, to explore new ideas, and to challenge those old ways of doing things.
Because, let's be real, the future of food is in our hands. The decisions we make today will shape the world we live in tomorrow.
That's a powerful thought. Well, I think it's time for us to wrap up this incredible deep dive into consumer interests and concerns around food.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
And to everyone listening, we hope you've enjoyed the ride. We encourage you to keep exploring, to keep learning, and to keep asking those tough questions about the food we eat.
Because the more we know, the better equipped we are to make good choices for ourselves, for our communities, and for the planet.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay hungry for knowledge.
Bon appétit.